The reason we're all here tonight is to do something extraordinary, and that is the quilt turnout. So we're very honored to have with us tonight Merikay Waldvogel, who is one of the nation's, I think, leading experts in quilts. And I got the privilege of hearing her last night talk, and it was absolutely amazing. She's written a couple of books on quilts. She's one of the leading experts, I think, in the country. And from what I understand, where she grew up, she didn't have quilts, and then she happened to have a quilt that she got and was in Chicago.
Yes.
And then she moved down to Knoxville and was able to really explore and get into quilts. But I'll let her tell that story. So I'm going to hand over to Mary now. Thank you so much for coming. We're very honored to have you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, thank you. Thank you, everybody, for coming. My name is Merikay Waldvogel, and I know we've got people out on Zoom too. This is exciting. Maybe some of my quilt friends, my family friends from all over the world now get a chance to see me do my thing. You know, they say that's true. There were no quilts in my life growing up in suburban St. Louis. But one quilt caught my fancy in Chicago and I got hooked. And I tell people, if you're thinking about starting to collect quilts, go with that first feeling. If it hooks you, get the quilt. And then I began to think I was getting a little carried away and maybe I should be a little bit more careful about the quilts that I was looking at. So I've tried to find out how to date quilts. And I'm going to tell you tonight, what we're going to do is look at these quilts that are behind me on upright racks that are all part of the quilt collection here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. And then we are actually going to have what's called a quilt turning. And we've got a bed here and there are 10 quilts underneath here. And we're going to, these are the ones on the bed are ones that have not really gotten much attention, but I put them in order by date. And so we're going to take them off one by one and talk about each one. And if you're a new quilt collector, you may learn how to date a quilt that you're from the quilts examples. This collection, the building opened in about what, 1990, or the East Tennessee Historical Society is very old, but it kind of got a staff together here, and then this gorgeous building opened. And the quilts that are here have, it's interesting, I think, as we go through, you're going to see that most of these quilts have been donated or people have purchased them at auction. Some of these are priceless pieces now, but somebody had the foresight to purchase them. And there are certain kind of guidelines about a quilt going into a collection here at the East Tennessee Historical Society. They should be from East Tennessee. And you'll see that most of these quilts are pretty old. And there are coverlets here too. We wanted to show you a few coverlets, a lot of coverlets. If you really want to see what this museum has, there's a website you could go to and see the whole collection. During COVID, they were able to put the quilts and a lot of objects, but we're mostly interested in the quilts today. So you could go to that link. I think they're going to put that up. And I think we'll start with the most famous quilt. I saw a lot of people standing in front of it while we were gathering. It's called the Knoxville Crazy Quilt. And a bit of a story on the background of this. I won't go into quite the detail on all the quilts that I'm going to with this one, because actually this does have a lot of things to talk about. An appraiser, a quilt appraiser in Georgia contacted me. I was from Knoxville. It contacted me because there are names of Knoxville businesses on this quilt. Knoxville on a crazy quilt. Yes, this is a crazy quilt. Crazy quilts were popular from about 1884 to about 1910. But most crazy quilts are velvets and satins And they have beautiful embroidery on them. And there are symbols that are kind of the same from one crazy quilt to another. This is totally different. It is a crazy quilt, but it's made of cotton, and the thread on it is thick and kind of coarse cotton. That's interesting. It looks to me when well, anyway, what happened was contacted me. I talked to the people here at the museum, and two of us went to see the quilt with our own eyes and decided that we had to get it here to Knoxville. It shouldn't be out there. And the owner was in North Carolina. How it got there, we still don't know. But anyway, it was Ginny Rogers, who was a board member, really, who gave the money to get this quilt here. So that name shows up a lot. She loved textiles and quilts. So anyway, we got the quilt, we got it home. And in the bottom corner, it says, Miss Lily Harvey, Brandel Avenue, Knoxville, Tennessee. That was the beginning. Who's Miss Lily Harvey? Where's Brandau? Brandau is over by Knoxville College. Whoa, Knoxville College, a historic Black college. On the bottom tier, we have images of African-American people. That's interesting. The middle tier are images of people. There's a family at a dining room table eating a meal, and the man is holding a newspaper that says Knoxville Sentinel across it. Now, those of you who are listening in from around the world, we know these places. These places are still here. It says on here, it says, I wish Mama would buy bread and cake at Kern's all the time. Kern's bread is it's no longer sold here, but the building is still here. The family was here from the late 1800s. So this began to be a way that I could date the quilt. I didn't know how old it was. And then finally at the top are pictures of military, Civil War soldier, Spanish-American War soldier. This block right here became a really important clue. It says Camp Poland, 1898. I actually called a historian here and they said, well, Camp Poland was the mustering place for soldiers to go to the Spanish-American War. And it was located up near Sharps Bridge, just here, north of downtown Knoxville. Camp Poland. And it turns out that probably those images up there of the soldiers in their tents with the little flaps that open up and the man like pulling up, fixing his boots. There were probably images that she saw or maybe saw in something published and transferred it into embroidery. Now I haven't mentioned the most important part is that this embroidery is like nothing, it's really unusual. There's a three-dimensional aspect to it. And we'll look here at the little girl in the center. Here's a little girl dressed. She's got her little shoestrings are on her socks she's trying to tie. The bag here is pulled tight. Back down at the women or the family at the table. Their dresses are, it looks like the little figures have been dressed before they were applied down. So I'm going to jump forward because I did a lot of research on this. Behind this is even some great stories. Like there was a scandal, there was a divorce, it just goes on, and the family broke up. The family, the parents were from England, Liverpool, England. He moved to first New York and then Wisconsin. They moved down here after the Civil War, and he opened a quarry. And his 4 grown adult children came with him. And Lily was one of those children. And I think there, it has a British look to it too. The embroidery, especially that dressed embroidery. So I think maybe her mother helped. So I'm going to say Anne Harvey and Lily Harvey worked on it. But just recently, I mean, since newspapers.com has come out, I put her name back in there again. It's to see what would come up in the Knoxville newspapers. In 1899, this quilt was on display in Knoxville at an event that was, it was an annual fair that they were holding to commemorate military. It was kind of like Veterans Day. And she worked a lot with Women's Relief Corps. And they would decorate the graves at the National Cemetery here in Knoxville. And I think we don't have a picture of her, but I think I've learned a lot about her. Her name is Lily Harvey. This image in the center, Wait for Me, was from a picture. It's a very same picture. This would have hung in somebody's living room in the 1880s or 90s. This was actually purchased in Knoxville, and it was from a home in South Knoxville. This one right here called Rainy Sabbath too is from a lithograph. There's an eagle up here called Old Abe, and Old Abe was a war eagle that went to the Civil War with a regiment from Wisconsin. And it's just an incredible thing. Well, anyway, we found a little carte de visite of Old Abe from Wisconsin. And here's a button from Camp Poland reunion. Wow. And a wooden box from A&P Tea Company here in Knoxville. So it's just a really interesting piece. So anyway, and the quilt on the over there is the newest quilt we have up here. It was probably made about 1990 by a woman named Helen Fleener, Helen Rose Fleener. She made about 20 quilts in the last 10 years of her life. She grew up pretty poor, didn't go past 8th grade, didn't spell very well, but she started making quilts, and in her own way. She said she wasn't a quilt maker. She said, I'm only a sewer. And she made each one as an individual little unit. So it's like this would be a little quilt, and she sewed them together, kind of potholder style. If you look at the back of this quilt, you could see what I'm talking about, because it's all different backings on it. And there are a lot of religious symbols on it, farm. Anyway, there are about 20 of them. And again, it was Brunk Auctions over in Asheville was auctioning them off, and located or contacted us ahead of time and said, did you ever hear of this woman? I hadn't. I know a lot about quilts in East Tennessee, and I'd never heard about it. So I wanted to go, and I took Linda Clausen and Michelle McDonald, the curator or collections person here, and we ended up purchasing 4 for the museum. So the museum owns 4. She made about 20. She's considered an outsider artist, and she's getting a lot of attention nationwide. You should go Google her name, Helen Fleener, and you'll see the prices have gone up on her quilts. And here we go. She's an original folk artist in a way, and really this is probably made about 1990. So we're going to look at these 2 quilts that one is inspired by the other. In about 1980, early 80s, Bets Ramsey and I started a state quilt survey. They were doing it in Kentucky. They did it in Texas. And we decided we're going to do it in Tennessee. And we're going to do it ourselves. And so we got some volunteers. One of them was Linda Clausen. You're going to hear her name a lot. We'll talk about her in just a minute. One of them was Linda Clausen. And so we traveled around the state. We had people bring out their quilts and show us, and we recorded information about the quilts. We took pictures. At the end, we'd seen, oh, and we had a cutoff date of 1930. I'm sorry we did that. At the time, it seemed like a good idea, but we had a cutoff date of 1930. So, and at the end, we'd seen about 1,215 quilts. We chose about 25 of them for this book and an exhibit that traveled around the state to all the big museums in the state. And during that survey, this quilt top showed up. And I saw a lot of people standing in front of this too. And two women, sisters, came in. This was in Chattanooga with this quilt top. And they had a question. What do we do with this? We're thinking of cutting it in half and dividing it, handing it, one. And Bets said, no, 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 you're not going to do that. Let's keep it together. And they did allow us to take a picture of it that day, but then they disappeared. And so there's a picture of it in the Quilts of Tennessee book. It did not travel around the state, and we lost track of it until about 10 or 15 years ago. And it was, somebody contacted us and said, Mary Kay, remember that quilt? I was at a tea shop in Chattanooga, and they're selling the Iora Almina Pool quilt, and her name is Iora Almina Pool. So we always called it the Iora quilt. So we got Helen, we've got Lily, and we've got Iora. We didn't know what they looked, well, we knew what Helen looked like, but we didn't really know who these people were. So anyway, I contacted Linda Clausen. I was out of town, and I said, Linda, Iora has appeared in Chattanooga. We made this quilt inspired by this top before this museum owned this. And so, I mean, we were really into Iora. And so Linda she got in her car that morning, drove to Chattanooga, and she was there when that tea shop opened, and she bought it. She came home. The people had also left a copy of Quilts of Tennessee. So she brought it back, and it was back to Knoxville. And then Jean Lester, who's here tonight, put a backing on it to preserve it. It was just a top, and you can imagine it was kind of flimsy. She stabilized it by putting a back on it and putting the braid on it for Linda. And then eventually Linda donated it to this museum. Linda Clausen, you're going to hear her name a lot, passed away about a year ago. She is a dear person to a lot of people in this room and to this museum. She and her husband have given a lot to this museum. And last night, at a special kind of honor little dinner for Linda, we shared stories, and the museum announced that they were naming the quilt collection the Linda Clausen Thursday Bee Quilt Collection. Yay! And I think you'll understand why it's so important to us when I talk about the next few quilts. First of all, she saved this one. But okay, Thursday Bee, what is Thursday Bee? First of all, there's Smoky Mountain Quilt Guild that's been around for more than 40 years and still in existence. I'm a proud member of it. And they always had these little satellite groups. They called them bees. I don't think, well, anyway, I'm just going to say it. In the beginning, and I was much, much younger, but in the beginning, it was like, those people who are kind of heading this up seem a little too rule-bound, uptight, you know how that always happens when another generation kind of comes in. Well, Linda said, I'm going to become president. And she did. She got elected president of the Smoky Mountain Quilt Guild. And she began doing loosening up. And she began doing some interesting new things. One of the things was she wanted a new bee, and she called it the Thursday bee because we always met on Thursday down South Knoxville in Kimberlin Heights. Her friend Eva Earl Kent had just opened a quilt shop down there. So we met at the quilt shop every Thursday. And we also had been several of them had helped me with the quilt documentation. One day we were there, we quilted all the time and we chatted, you can imagine. It was just a wonderful little group. Jim Lyles, who was a dye expert from UT, came to the meeting. We didn't know him. And he had a pile of fabric in all these beautiful colors. He was using natural dyes, mineral dyes, to make cotton. He dyed cotton fabric to look like it was the 19th century dyes. And he had all this stuff and he said, what am I going to do with it? And he asked us to make a quilt that he could put behind him when he gave talks about natural dyes. And, we could have done something simple, little baskets, or maybe little stars or something. Not Linda. Really, Linda sparked the idea and all of us went with it. And she said, let's make one like Iora made. And let's take the blocks that we saw during the Quilts of Tennessee survey. And she said, who wants to do it? And lots of people did. And so, it was just free form. Make a block the size you want, use Jim's fabrics, and let's see what happens. So all these quilts, these squares came out in different shapes and sizes. And Linda and Eva Earl put them up on the wall and created this collage look and filled in. You could see there are a lot of little fill-ins all throughout. And that's exactly what Iora had done in about 1880 over there. So this was made about 1990. And then it came the quilting. And Jim Lyle's wife, Dale Lyles, was a spinner, and she grew cotton in her backyard. Not too many people grow cotton. So she carded the cotton for batting. And so this thing is filled with hand-carded bats, not mountain mist bat, not commercial. And everything is done by hand. All the quilting was done by hand. If you look right here, there's a little hand print. And that's what we saw in a quilt from Gatlinburg. It was a stuffed quilt with a little hand. And so we decided, let's do a stuffed quilt there too. So and it's gotten a lot of, anyway, Jim passed away recently. Well, his wife ended up owning it. And she said, Thursday Bee ought to have this. And Thursday Bee said, who's going to keep it? So we donated it to this museum. The quilt back here is another one Thursday Bee made. It was made in 1987. It was a contest put on by the Appalachian Regional Commission in commemoration of the US Constitution. And again, we're using the same fabrics that he was providing. And this is supposed to be, it's called Sheltering Hills, and it's supposed to refer to the Appalachian Mountains and that freedom is sheltered here in this area, and the importance of the Constitution. Finally, the one over here, are we doing all right? Okay, good. This one was, it's called Yellow Ribbons. It was designed by Linda Clausen when she was president. It's a kind of a friendship star. I think you could see that. But she decided to make it yellow ribbons. And by just changing the color, it became a different kind of quilt. This was made in about 1990 during that horrible, we think we have a pretty tough time right now in our world, but those back then it was hostages. It was during the Gulf War, and a lot of people were being taken hostage. And that's what they were commemorating here. The Guild, Smoky Mountain Quilt Guild, made these blocks. The names are here. And Joni McGinnis put it together. I think it was really supposed to be Linda's, but Joni had gotten so close to this quilt. Her mother quilted it all by hand, and it ended up being Joni's quilt, but she donated it also to this collection. In 1993, when the journalist Terry Anderson, who had been a hostage, was freed, and he wrote a book. She went to see him when he gave a speaking engagement at Walter State, and she had him sign the quilt. And so there's a signature right here of where he signed it. So the quilt has been given and his book to the museum. So this is history under the covers. So you've seen probably the most original pieces that are in the collection. And I think we might start the other part of does anybody have any questions at this point? We're going to start the one where I'm going to talk about how to date quilts using these quilts. Any questions yet? If anybody wants links or anything like that, please leave your email address over there and we'll get some information to you. Because the Zoom people are getting links, I think, as they go along. But you've got the benefit of seeing the quilts yourself and getting up close. Okay, why don't we start? My two holders, now does this make sense? I think I'm going to stay over here. My two holders are Sherry Casper and Jane Dunham from the Smoky Mountain Quilters. This one was given last night to this collection by Karen Clausen, whose mother is Linda Clausen. And remember, I told you they named the quilt collection the Linda Clausen Thursday Bee Quilt Collection. It was made by her mother, and there's a name and date there. It says Little Women, 1950, and her mother's name. It turns out, and these are all images from Little Women. They're applique images. I think it's kind of neat to compare those images, applique, to Helen Fleener's at the far left, and even Lily Harvey's, the second one. Now, if truth be told, this is how Linda and I met. The very first quilt sharing I did, she brought this quilt to show me. And she said, she kind of whispered in my ear, I don't really like this. And I said, oh, but I do. I know a whole lot about this. And that was it. You know, we just clicked. And what's neat about this, it is a kit, it's a pattern. And I think that's what made her, I think she felt there was too frou-frou or something. And, but I think it's Little Women. I loved Little Women, so did she. And so see, people are seeing it. It was published in, I think, Ladies' Home Journal in 1950, and you could buy the patterns. It was a line drawing, and then you made yourself one and put it together. So it's not quite as original as Linda's usually are, but okay. So that's a brand new piece. It's from 1950. Now, the quilts that I'm showing you tonight, yeah. The quilts that I'm showing you tonight have dates on them for the most part. And that, if you're starting out collecting quilts, it's a great thing to find a dated piece, because then you can compare other undated pieces to it. This is called Mariner's Compass. And it's one of the oldest pieces in the collection. It's attributed to Grandma Coward, that's all. And it's considered to be circa 1850. And the Cowards lived in Anderson County, Tennessee, over kind of near Clinton and Oak Ridge. Now, a quilt from 1850 often will have these colors: red, green, yellow. You see another one back there beside the yellow ribbon quilt. That one is called Rose of Sharon. And I think it's maybe one of the it's just a fabulous piece too. And it's from the Riverdale community here in Knox County. And it's from the 1850s too. You'll notice that the quilting all by hand is very, very close and heavy. This one has what's called stuffing right here, these plumes. You could see another distinguishing kind of regional characteristic of East Tennessee and Southern quilts are these spiky things and in a circle. This circle is actually, I think, set into the white background. So again, 1850s on those two quilts, okay? Look at the back of this. You might hold that up in front of the camera. Look at you can see the stuffing. When I say stuffing, some people might call it trapunto, but it probably wasn't called trapunto when it was first made. White quilts were really popular in much earlier than this, probably from 1810 up to 1830 or 40. And the stuffing lasted much longer in East Tennessee than it did in the upper Northeast. We're not sure why. That's something we found in the state quilt survey. Around Ray County, there's a lot of stuffing like this. Okay. Now the next quilt, while they're getting that ready, let's go look at the one over here to the far right. Isn't this one beautiful? Rose of Sharon. And this is applique, beautifully done. But this one is the one I wanted to talk about. And this is a pattern that some people call New York Beauty, New York Beauty. They didn't make this quilt in New York. And really it took something like the quilt surveys all around the country to realize that. For some reason, these quilts are showing up in Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, North Georgia, and even some of them are calling it New York Beauty now. Because in 1930, the Mountain Mist Batting Company started selling a pattern that they arbitrarily named New York Beauty. Still nobody's quite sure why, but they're the reason. It became so popular during that quilt revival that everybody started calling this pattern New York Beauty. We know it's called, because we've seen a lot of these, either Rocky Mountain Road or Crown of Thorns. And this one has some beautiful quilting in it. Lots of really nice quilting. And again, the tiny points, two of those regional characteristics of East Tennessee quilts are represented here. The other thing I want to point out for a dating thing, this quilt was originally green and red against a white background. And all the green is what's called fugitive. It faded to this kind of khaki color. That turns out to be a really good dating clue. If you see a green that's faded to the beige, it's probably 1880s or later, after the Civil War. If it's before the Civil War, the green holds. A lot of people are surprised when you stop and think the older quilts sometimes have the better fabrics, the better dyes than the things we have today. And then you think again, you think, well, I can see why that might have happened. Anyway, let's look at the next one. And here we go. What do you see? Maybe another. It's very close to another New York beauty. It has the points and the green. This one, though, I don't think ever saw the light of day. And the green has not faded. You might say it's pre-Civil War, but it's this fabric. It's red, but there's a white kind of a ivy print on it. It's a really unusual fabric. And I think this might be a surprise. I have a feeling that this might have been made 1890s to 1910. We're still, the verdict's not in yet, but it came from the Kitzmiller family from Greene County, Tennessee, and we're saying 1890 to 1910, based on some genealogy too. Okay, so you've learned that clue. Middle 18, with especially applique and 19th century red and green quilts. The next three are all browns, brown prints. After the Civil War, when this quilt was made, or maybe this was made right about the time of the Civil War, the mills throughout the country began to put out a lot of different fabric prints, and browns were really kind of popular. And that's what's represented in this quilt. If you look back at, well, see, here's one that's kind of close. Here's one that's very close. We call this double, I think it's called double axe head. So that's kind of a utilitarian quilt. And something we found out, or we noticed in the quilts that we saw in Tennessee, they don't have borders on them, especially the utilitarian quilts. They just put the blocks together, very matter of fact, a piece block, a plain block, a piece block, a plain block. And it's, again, a really strong regional characteristic of Tennessee quilts. So this is about 1870, 80s based on the fabrics. This one is not dated though, okay? Now the next one, is called Pavement. We're beginning to see some patterns that were published. And here is one. Again, it has this very similar brown fabrics, two different colors of brown, and a utilitarian quilt. And probably, it is definitely from Jonesboro, from the McLinn women, Martha Carson, Lucinda McLinn Carson, and Sophie McLinn of Jonesboro, Tennessee, in Washington County. Again, about 1880s. Okay, and the next one is another checkerboard quilt. You could look at the quilting is pretty utilitarian too. It's not stuffed, doesn't have a lot of plumes on it. It's pretty straightforward and probably was made at a quilting bee or together with other people. The next one is a top. And remember, this one was a top too when we first got it. So why do we save tops? Why do we conserve? How does this one end up in a quilt collection in a museum? Well, first of all, it has a tag on it, a cloth tag over there that says, the note attached to it says, M.K. Kennedy to H.K. Campbell, 1890. So there it's dated. Now you have to kind of think, what was the reason it was given, and what does that date represent? But we know it was Martha Jane Kennedy was her name, and her son was Hugh Kennedy Campbell. This came from, again, East Tennessee, from the Sproul auction out in the Riverdale community. That was quite a day when that auction happened. I don't know if anybody else in this room. It was an old house filled with many, many wonderful paintings and ephemera and photos and lots of quilts. And again, we went out there and saw them. And this time it was Knox County government gave us Knox County government. Can you imagine? They gave some money to this museum, to the staff, to actually bid on some pieces. And I mean, they're wonderful. So why do we collect this? Why would this be important? Besides the date, is this fabric is pristine. This is the way it looked when it came out, when it was first purchased. It's never been washed. It's called checkerboard or 25 square. Pretty clever. All right. And then the next one is a basket quilt. And I was looking to see if that particular pattern was in one of these. I don't see it right now. Do you see one? You do see one. Where? Oh, right here. Yeah, that's really called chips. Yeah, it's not exactly the same, but it's very, very close. Let's put this out front too. Now here's a totally different look. A finished quilt and kind of a bright, again, we're thinking of dating quilts. This one has a date on it of, it's names, it's friendship names on here and initials on these baskets. And one of them says February 22nd, 1899. 1899. And someone today brought a quilt that I said, oh, it has neon fabrics. And that's not exactly the right word, neon, but this black fabric that has kind of a bright, I mean, the colors almost look like they pop off the page, off the fabric. We call them neon. It's kind of a descriptive term. They came out about 1889, 1890. And it's a good way to date a quilt, about 1900. This one actually has a date on it of February 22nd, 1899 on one of these little blocks. Someday, somebody should come and do some research on this and write down all the names and try to figure out why this quilt was given and who the people were, what joins all these names together. That becomes a really fun part about quilt history. That's why I really got into the Lily Harvey quilt too. It is a quilt, of course it's warm and you can cuddle up and you can display it, but there's so much history that there's a story in these quilts that sometimes you could figure out by doing some genealogical research. And now it's a lot easier because you can do it from your your home, from your phone, in fact. Okay. Do any of you collect quilts? Yeah, yes. What kind of quilts?
I've always bought ones I like.
You've always bought ones you like.
Some that were made by my great grandmothers
Where did she live?
in northern Alabama.
Northern Alabama. Those are always good ones. There are Facebook pages that, if you're interested, there's one called History of the South Quilt page. It's great. And there are lots of quilts from Alabama that show up there. People just put up a quilt from the South and we talk about it, we compare it. Sometimes they set a weekly theme, like show us this week it's goblet quilts. And they're little quilts with they look like little, turns out it's a block that was published in a newspaper. So they show up all over, but a lot of them.
It's called the Dresden plate.
Yours is Dresden plate?
And it's made, the fabric is my mother's grandmother made it for her out of dresses that she had.
It was a Dresden plate made out of, the blocks are made out of fabric from dresses that she had as a child. This is the other beauty of quilts. Anybody else collecting them? Well, the one I'm going to show you now is that kind of quilt. I'm not sure, first of all, it's kind of rough. There's holes in it. If you look from the back, you could really see some holes in it. But it's a lovely little quilt. It's had a wonderful life. We're not sure who it came from, where it came from. I'm not even sure how it ended up in this collection, but it has a date on it. And the embroidered date is 1915. And that becomes, here's the date right here, that makes this group of fabrics in this quilt kind of a dating document again. There's so many fabrics in here that if you see another quilt that might have some of those fabrics, it would be a first step to dating a quilt that you loved, that you get. And then this one also has, I put it here because it represents a change. You know, we saw red and green and yellow, we saw browns, and now this represents a change in palettes. And I'm sure it's women's clothes, but it also shows up in quilts with this with a navy, black, and sometimes gray and a kind of a claret looking fabric. So the other thing to look at here is that this is what's called a string quilt. And it's made of little pieces. It's called a string star. A string is a little piece of fabric left over, probably from a sewing project. Especially, it happened again because of COVID. People began to go back and finish their unfinished projects. And suddenly you get this little bunch of scraps, you know, beside you. And because it's COVID, or because you feel, you know, kind of cozy or nested, you think, I can't throw those poor little pieces away. And you save, I can imagine how this happened at one time, now that from what we've been through in the last couple of years. And I'm quite sure that's what's going on here, that she's saved little pieces and she's put it into this quilt top. A sweet quilt, a dated quilt, and let's not pass them up. We still need to be saving these. They're still out there. Okay. And the next one is a really spectacular piece I had never seen before. They gave me a special tour, whatever. And this, I'm not sure. We know that it is called a feathered star. It's a 2-color quilt. two-color quilt, excuse me, it is a two-color quilt, but quilts made of a solid color, in this case red and then the white, are really hard to date. They're almost impossible. Sometimes it's the print on them that helps date it. This could have been made in the 1850s as well as today. This red doesn't really fade. The pattern was popular back in the 1850s, 60s, feathered star. But there's lots of writing on it. And right there in the center, it says, presented to Gertrude Alt Pope, March 26th, 1928. So really, I was surprised. And it was made in Pikeville, Tennessee, down kind of in between Chattanooga and kind of Crossville in there. And there are many other embroidered names on it, but the dates are always 1928. Now, we need to figure out who Gertrude Alt Pope was. She was being presented a really lovely quilt by friends. And again, it would be a great, this one quilt would be worth a really nice article in American Quilt Study Group Journal or all kinds of things. I just think it's a wonderful quilt. But it's here to remind you when you're collecting quilts, if you see red and white quilts, they were popular about the time of the Spanish-American War and the Pan American World's Fair. And these red and white embroidery pieces came out about that same time, like this. I like to think about the fact that it reminds me of the Red Cross. Of course, Red Crosses have turkey bread like this. Again, when it was established. So I guess I would have thought when I first looked at this that it might have been 1900 or 1910, but in fact it was a little bit later. And thanks to it being signed and dated, we know a lot more about this quilt. Okay.
Still live in Cumberland County. I mean, in Pikeville and Bledsoe County.
Say that again.
Oaks, is that?
Yeah.
And the Alts, AULD.
Right.
Those families still live in Bledsoe County and Pikeville.
But you had never seen this quilt before? Say, this is the serendipity that happens when you do a quilt sharing like this. Someone in the audience who knows that these families still live there in this small area of Tennessee shows up here and sees this quilt. I guess before we show the grandmother's flower garden, it's important to talk about, sometimes it's important to show, talk about care of quilts too. What you see here are some discolorations at the, looks like a brown area at the folds. Quilts, if they're left folded for a long time, and especially if this one probably was folded and stored in a cedar chest, a wooden cedar chest. We think that's a good place for valuables, but in fact, the wood, when the fabric touches the wood, some of the oils will migrate out into the fabric. And this is a very common thing to see on the back of the quilt. Luckily, this quilt has been stored with the backside on the outside. Imagine if it had been stored on the other side, we'd have those brown marks right through it. So in the future, put tissue paper, that's what they use here at the museum, around these quilts and in all the folds. But if you're at home and you use what you can, and if you have to store it in a wooden chest or a drawer, wrap the quilt with another sheet, a cotton sheet, and then put all that together, put that together in the drawer. So the sheet is touching the wood and not the quilt itself. Okay, got that? Plastic is not a good place, not a good thing at all, good for quilts either. Now, a lot of you probably know this pattern, right? Grandmother's flower garden, just simply called flower garden. The collection owns 5 quilts by this woman, and her name was McCamey. Florence Day McCamey. It was made in about 1930s. This became a really, really popular pattern, a classic American quilt pattern. And I think she made it in her own way. I think those of you who are looking at it from afar can see what she's done by arranging the yellows and then the purples in concentric circles, ending with the pink in the center. So in the 30s, the colors changed remarkably. We think of the 30s as some of the darkest time of our country's life. But in fact, it doesn't really show in the fabrics. There's a lot of very bright pastel colors. Some people even call them Crayola kind of colors, pure colors. And women and companies like Mountain Mist, magazines, newspapers began to offer quilt patterns, and it was a way to sell more fabric. And again, I'm sure it was like we've just been through with the pandemic. It was a time where people were feeling kind of low and remembering the good old days and trying to bring out, some of that resourcefulness and creativity. And so they turned to making quilts. And the 30s saw a lot of quilt making. And so this is the kind of color that you're going to see from the 1930s. Okay. Beautifully quilted also. There is a stain on the back of this one, probably a water stain. Another thing to be concerned about. Be careful with quilts. And I'm going to end with a little discussion over here about a few coverlets. And I might ask a friend or two if I. Knoxville and the Smoky Mountains. If you visit the Great Smoky Mountain National Park, if you've lived here a while, you've heard the story of the Walker sisters and the home that they stayed in to the end of their lives, even though the federal government told them to leave. And the 5 sisters looked at them and said, try it, just try it. Anyway, they ended up living in the Great Smoky Mountains in their cabin. The cabin is still there. It's being repaired right now, but you could still go visit it. Their mother was a weaver. There were looms in the house when they finally moved out of the house, along with spinning wheels and a lot of coverlets. They finally made the national news in a magazine article, and people began to flock. This is in the 40s. People began to flock to the park, not just to see the beauty of the park, but to meet these women. And they greeted the tourists. This was their father. This picture was taken in 1918. Their father's name was John Walker. And the picture was taken with a coverlet behind him. This was pretty typical in the South. An itinerant photographer would go around and the family would line up in front of a quilt and have their picture taken. Here, they lined up in front of the coverlet. So when the sisters left the cabin, the park ended up also with the contents of the cabin. A lot of coverlets, but it turns out they also made quilts. And that's what I was interested in, was the quilts. I was a weaver, so I was interested in the coverlets too. Anyway, recently, we were back again with a friend who's here right now. We went back to the National Park Preservation Center. And I said to them, where's the coverlet that's behind John Walker? And they said, we don't have it. And I said, I think I've seen it. I saw it at an exhibit at the East Tennessee Historical Society a few years ago. And they said, well, that's news to us. And believe it or not, this coverlet was in this collection. And well, I'm not sure how it all happened, but there are surprises in this collection. And it was again, a grant from I think the Tennessee state government that paid for it to come to this museum. It's a really important quilt. Excuse me, a really important coverlet. The name of it is Snail's Trail, is that right? It shows up in, it's called Cat Tracks and Snail Trail. Cat Tracks and Snail Trail. This is what's called an overshot coverlet. These are very common in the South. You don't see these up north. I bet in your family you have these also. This one is a really beautiful one, and it appeared in a book called Textile Art from the Southern Appalachia region. It's a coverlet and the pattern here is called Vanishing Wave. Wool and cotton, wool and cotton. Now this one, I asked them to put up also. It's in a little bit of a shabby situation. It's a lot like the string star we just looked at. But they say that this is made of linen. And that is what I'm hoping that we could do a little bit of research on, that it's linen and wool. We'll have to look more closely at it, but it's worn and it has a typical pattern too. So anyway, that's the end of our program tonight. I want you to remember Linda Clausen, whose picture is right here. And last night, the Thursday Bee gave this little quilt top to the museum's collection in honor of Linda. And now I think you might understand why. Linda Clausen had all these fabrics left. She wouldn't throw anything away. And guess where they came from? From that piece from Jim Lyle's. You could see the fabric was used many places. And so when her daughter invited the Thursday Bee to come over and help disperse, to hand out, distribute the fabric, I took some and gave it to Bets Ramsey, who was the co-author with me of that Quilts of Tennessee project. She's 99 and a half years old. She lives in Nashville, and she loved Linda too. And so she made this in honor of Linda. And rather than put the pieces together, she just appliqued them down. So they're rough pieces. It says Linda Combs Clausen and her birth and death date, 1941 to 2021. So, and in the back, she documented it well and said that the fabric was from Jim Lyle's and that it was Linda's work. So a few things that you've learned, maybe how to date a quilt, maybe how to preserve the quilt, but basically love quilts. Sleep under them, enjoy them, keep them. Let's have some more made. So thank you, all of you.